Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the November Lunch and Learn for the League of Women Voters of Monterey County. I'm Dennis Marr, the president for this year. To prepare to make these remarks, I read statements from state and national league leaders to understand how close I could get to the nonpartisan line before stepping over it. Then I realized that I could inadvertently become Exhibit A for our today's speaker, Professor Stephen Hughes, regarding polarization of American politics, so I scrapped all those notes. Because it doesn't matter who won office on November the 5th, the League will continue with its mission of defending democracy.
I met Steve a couple years ago through OLLI, the OLLI program, the over 50 program from CSU and me. He's become quite a draw. He's got a following. He kind of sells out. That's not exactly the way OLLI works, but he has a full house. And just so as an introduction, many Americans, including journalists and scholars and others, have bemoaned our descent into highly divisive, acrimonious politics. It seems that polarization has become the defining characteristic of our time. But what exactly is polarization? And is that an apt term for the current state of American politics? If so, what are the characteristics of our polarization, and might we find a way out? So this is the challenge, and this is the subject. Steve Hughes is an Emeritus Professor in Politics and Public Administration from the CSU Stanislaus. He's got a career in public education and politics, education about politics, Center for Public Policy Studies, and anyway, he was a key leader on the faculty at Stanislaus as well. You will enjoy his presentation, not only, but enjoy what he says and how he says it, but you'll also be well informed. So I look forward to this. Welcome.
You know, as an academic, you sometimes worry a little bit about coming up and saying things in convoluted ways, but anybody that's going to start with the day after today, I feel this is going to be no problem. I think. So thank you. It's an absolute honor to be here. And in fact, before I get into the polarization, I want to give my thanks to you all. When she formed the League of Women Voters almost 105 years ago, Carrie Chapman Catt fully understood that winning passage of the 19th Amendment was a mere beginning, was not an ending. And she understood the constant struggle for voter motivation, voter education, and all that surrounds that. And I am so delighted with the work you do. So my applause to you for carrying on Kat's tradition and legacy and her goals. So thank you. So, political polarization. As a political scientist, I've been for years involved in trying to understand political behavior. And it seems like from a sort of an academic and research standpoint, we get a couple of steps forward in progress, and then we understand that we don't understand, and we move back a step or two, and it's kind of like that. But what's been interesting for me in thinking about, when I started talking about polarization at OLLI, is to realize in my career, I retired about 14 years ago, and in my career, we rarely talked about polarization. It was not a common part of the language of political scientists. Historians, particularly political historians, somewhat more so, and you'll see why in a moment, but not among us. So it turns out we're in a little bit different times than the times that I went through, most of us went through. So what polarization is all about, in simple terms, is a coming apart. It's, in political terms, movement further from the center to the left and further from the center to the right. There are typically two dimensions of polarization that we think about. The most sort of common one is one that centers around public policy issues. So you get politicians, you get us, you get others debating politics, and solutions start moving further away from the center. And in general term, we can talk about this in ideological terms, right? So you're moving more from the center, more to on the right to the conservative to reactionary, and whatever is then beyond that. On the left from the center to liberal to maybe socialist, and so on and so forth. So that's the public policy dimension of liberalism. Of polarization. But there's a second dimension that's getting a lot more attention in the last few years, and that's the affective dimension of polarization, the more emotionally based. But we can also think of that in terms of moving apart too. We get less friendly. We talk to people a little bit less who don't agree with us, and then finally we move out to levels of anger and dislike and downright hatred. So when we think of polarization, and as I move forward and talk about it, think about it existing sort of at those two levels, not necessarily simultaneously. So then we can ask a whole bunch of questions, the ones that George raised. And the one I'm going to start with first is this a really, truly unusual time in American history? Because again, what we're used to is a quieter, less raucous, less acrimonious, and definitely less polarized politics. That's what we all grew up with. So is that the norm in the weird time? And it turns out that what's weird is the non-polarized time. Between September 1787 and August 1788, as you may recall, we had this, I know I wasn't there either, but my grandkids think I was. So we had this thing called the Constitution. It was written, it was to be ratified, and we got into a debate, and it was sort of instant polarization. We divided into Federalist and Anti-Federalist. And we got to the point where we were just people then were absolutely yelling at each other. And there was the ideological / policy debate about the terms of the Constitution, with the Federalists, of course, wanting a stronger central government. We, at that point in time, were under something called the Articles of Confederation. There were many who thought the Articles were failing, and America was just going to fall apart. And we needed to do something to bring us back together. Pretty much each of the states had their own currency. Economic issues were just impossible. There was no president at that time. The national government was a Congress, which met very irregularly. And when it did meet, typically didn't get a quorum, because everything was centered around the states, and so why bother going off to Philadelphia and so forth. So that didn't happen, and then we were a laughingstock around the world, because with no commander-in-chief, no real military to speak of, and a lot of people felt, that's not a healthy way to stay alive as a nation. So that's the Federalist position. The Anti-Federalist position was, we're really happy with the power being in the states, and we kind of like the idea that there isn't that much of a central government. There were originally some in the sort of Anti-Federalist camp that were willing to say, we'll make a few modifications here and there, and then we can move forward. And the Federalists basically said, no, this is the Constitution. And so you've got to have it. The other thing that happened during this period of time is that almost all of the newspapers, particularly those of any significant circulation, became either adamantly Federalist or vociferously anti-Federalist, and they fueled the affective polarization, absolutely fueled it. So if it was a Federalist writing about some anti-Federalist that was out there, a John Jay, say, for instance, then they would talk about that person in the most scurrilous terms. And they would invent stuff. Surprise, right, I know. We have a long history of that, too. So there was massive misinformation on both sides, leading to the point where the anger occasionally would erupt The scene being depicted here was actually initially a march by Federalists. Off to the wings, there were a couple of groups of anti-Federalists. They moved in and attacked the Federalists, and you ended up with this huge brawl. This was in July 13, 1788. So, right out of the gate, polarization of a very acrimonious and even violent period. Ultimately, the country would hang together in a great deal because of George Washington. And things started working, and some of this subsided for a while until we got to a point where a whole nother issue became the central issue of American politics and absolutely divided us into the worst, most violent, most devastating period of polarization we have ever experienced. And that was the growing debate over slavery. Joanne Freeman is a professor of history, and she wrote a very interesting book about violence in Congress during the period leading up to the Civil War, not during the Civil War, but up to the Civil War. And she was able to document 60 cases of significant violence in Congress between the abolitionists and the slave owners around the issue of slavery. The most dramatic of which came to be called the caning of Senator Charles Sumner. This happened in 1858. Sumner was from Massachusetts, a strong abolitionist, a Republican, and he used to love to stand up in the Senate and give these fiery abolitionist speeches, and he used to just love to goad the Southerners. And the Southerners did not like to be goaded, and they were not averse to being fairly violent. So in this 1858 speech, among other things, Sumner says, Senator Butler, a senator from South Carolina, has chosen a mistress, I mean the harlot slavery. Butler was not there to defend himself. He was rather ill. He was back home in South Carolina, but he did have a relative who was a member of the House of Representatives who did not take kindly to this speech. But 3 days later, Preston Brooks, the person in question, with his cane, came literally sort of flying into the Senate chambers, found Sumner, who was at his desk writing some letters. Brooks goes up to Sumner and says, Mr. Sumner, I read your speech with care and as much impartiality as was possible, and I felt it was my duty to tell you that you have libeled my state and slandered a relative who is aged and absent, and I am come to punish you for it. Raised his cane and started just clobbering Senator Sumner, and kept, and then the cane broke. And that's when he stopped. And as you can see from the picture, there's another senator who has his back to Preston Brooks, holding other senators at bay who might have tried to intervene. It would take Senator Charles Sumner 3 years to recover enough to be able to return to the Senate. But in Massachusetts, they continued to re-elect him. There was an intervening election. They re-elected him, and then they had a black drape over his desk in the Senate. Perhaps the extreme of polarization. A number of years ago, a group of political scientists got curious about this whole issue of polarization and the history of it and said, let's go back to all of the congressional roll call votes that we can easily get our hands on, and the ones that were easy to get to went back to 1878. And he said, we want to look at the roll call vote, see how people are voting. And they came up with a methodology that then allowed each member of Congress to be assigned a number on where they fit on a liberal conservative continuum. Then you would get a diagram of all of those votes, and then you would give a score for that whole session of the House or the Senate as to whether it was not very polarized or very polarized. So what you have here is in green the score for the degree of polarization in the House of Representatives from 1878 to 2006, and then the black line for the Senate. The study that was done, from which this is taken, was concluded in 2006. So that's as far as this goes. But you can see that it's very high and rising higher. So indeed, we are in particularly strong polarization terms, or high polarization terms. But as you can see, if you go back the other way, there's a long history of polarization. And it only goes back to 1878 and doesn't even take into account the kinds of things I was just initially talking about, the polarization around the debate of the Constitution, the polarization around slavery, and so on and so forth. And in fact, what you see is that there's a relatively short period of time in which polarization is essentially non-existent. You just get normal sort of partisan debate, discussion, whatever you want to call it. And as you can see from this, it basically goes, that period of low polarization basically goes from roughly about the 1930s, mid-1930s, about to maybe the 1970s. So it turns out, when you look at American political history, and you talk about polarization, and you want to explain it, it turns out what needs explaining is that period of time in which polarization was low. Why was that the case? That's what's not normal. I hate to tell you, but what we're in now is what's much more common in American history, not the other way around. So there isn't time to really go into that in detail, but I thought I would just hit a couple of high points. So the key to that low polarization was a number of factors. One of the big factors was Franklin Roosevelt, for two reasons. Perhaps first and foremost because he was brilliant at knowing that American people needed to hear some nice, kind, consoling words because we were in a Great Depression. And it was rough times. And Roosevelt understood that. And Roosevelt understood there was a great deal of fear and anger and insecurity out there. And so every single radio station that he could find that had a national audience, he got in touch with the owners, got the microphones, and the famous fireside chats and so on and so forth of Roosevelt. The second part of Roosevelt was that he and his administration were particularly effective at dealing with problems. They identified problems, they moved quickly, they moved broadly, and with a reasonable amount of success. So there is that. The backdrop is initially the Great Depression, which was exactly that, but it was so widespread and so devastating that it actually brought people together. If they had a leader to help bring them together, and we did at that period of time. Then along comes World War II, a very rough period of time, but if anything, bring the American people even closer together. So these are the factors that really stand out to me in terms of helping to explain why such little polarization during that time period. There is another side to that story, however, and that's the issue of civil rights, and particularly of rights for Black Americans. What the photograph is showing you there is a march initially organized by the NAACP calling on the government to enact an anti-lynching law, which you'd think would be, right? Right? I mean, who's not against lynching? Well, it turns out a lot of people. And so it was hard to get passage. There was a bill that was starting to work its way through Congress. Eleanor Roosevelt had been working very diligently with the NAACP to push that bill. What they finally all realized was we can't get this bill through Congress unless we have the very strong backing of the president. So Eleanor went to the president and said, you've got to come out in favor of this bill. I mean, we need this bill. We've got to have an anti-lynching law at the very least. And Roosevelt said the following: if I come out for the anti-lynching bill now, Southern Democrats will block every bill I ask Congress to pass to keep America from collapsing. I just can't take the risk. So the other side of the coin in why low polarization was because blacks were sold out. Sometimes polarization can be useful and even necessary. This was a time in which we didn't have polarization, when it could have been useful and necessary to have more of it. So it's an interesting message. So this is today. This is the current United States House of Representatives. So remember that graph, and I mentioned the political scientists, and they looked at all of these roll call votes, and they have this methodology that allows them to assign members of Congress to a position on a liberal conservative continuum. So what the dots represent are the current members of the House of Representatives, the outgoing House of Representatives. On the horizontal axis, the issues that are being aligned there all have to do with economic issues, or the votes that are aligned there all have to do with economic issues, whether it's tax policies, income redistribution policies, Medicare policies, all that kind of stuff is along that line. The further to the right, the more conservative, the further to the left, the more liberal. The vertical dimension it just refers to as other votes. It's mostly on social issues. On that particular scale, the higher up the assignment goes, the more conservative. Down at the bottom, the more liberal. So if you're way over in that corner, by Barbara Lee or further on, would be the most liberal you could get, the most conservative. It would be up here roughly with about McCormick of Georgia. So a couple of things you can see about this. The first thing that you really notice is all that empty space in the middle. That would be bipartisanship. That would be the absence of polarization. And you don't see much of it there. If I had, instead of choosing to do the House, if I had done the Senate, there would be 4 people that you would see towards the center, 2 of whom are gone. Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kristen Sinema of Arizona. The other 2 will remain, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. That's it in terms of more or less centrist senators. And you don't see a whole lot of centrist members of the House. So this is where we are now. This is the most polarized part of American society without question, is the United States Congress. And it's been doing a bit more and more of this for some time. So the question is, that then arises, is the American public the same way? And the answer is sort of. So this is the result of research done by the Pew Research Center, one that I personally think is a very good research outfit. What they did was that they created a 10-item survey scale, asking people on basically agree, disagree, or yes or no, various kinds of issues. You know, yes, Social Security should be protected. No, it should be dismantled. I made that one up. And so you end up with then putting people on, a liberal to conservative continuum. So you can see what we have here is 2 groupings. The top grouping takes into account people that they identified, the Pew Research Center identified as politically engaged, us. And the simple definition of that was essentially people who vote all of the time. And then everybody else is in the second group. The third group represents probably a little bit less than about 30% of the adult population. You can see that what's happening among people like us is increasing polarization, so that by the time you get to 2014, you've got substantial polarization. One thing to understand about our current politics, and specifically Donald Trump, is that he did not create the polarization that we are in. I would say it's the other way around. Donald Trump exists and is successful because of the polarization that we are in. Now, the other thing that you notice about this research results is that second, much larger group, it too shows some movement, a little bit of growing apart, that very basic definition of polarization, but a lot less so. And in fact, the gap in 2014 among the less engaged is even narrower than it was back in 1994 among the more engaged. So this suggests that there are potentially ways out, that there are a whole lot of people in this country that will end up voting and on the surface behaving in a way that looks like they're just as polarized as anybody else or adding to the polarization, but are not necessarily. So that's a perhaps somewhat hopeful sign. Now we get to the affective part of polarization. So this is a little bit more recent information, again by the Pew Research Center, going from the years 2016 to 2022. You can see what's going on here is that in virtually every case, whether it has to do with thinking of the other person as closed-minded or not, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, or lazy, the gap is growing with one exception, which is that Democrats don't think Republicans are lazy. Otherwise, I'm not speaking to a Republican, but at least that Republican is not a lazy Republican. But that's not healthy stuff, right? I mean, you see what's happening. More and more we think the other person of the other party is closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, and not very bright. Right? Good luck with some conversations in this context. So a big question becomes, how do you break through with that if one is concerned about polarization, and where to go with it? How do you begin to deal with that? Tough stuff. A more recent study done at the very beginning of this year, I find interesting and potentially disturbing. So a combination of the outfit YouGov and The Economist magazine combined forces. They did some focus groups on trying to identify some phrases that might capture how people sort of succinctly summarize their view of the world. And ultimately what they did was that they came up with the two phrases that you see up here. One phrase says, "It's a big, beautiful world, mostly full of good people, and we must find a way to embrace each other and not allow ourselves to become isolated." So when they then did a large random sample of American adults, they found that 45% of that sample agreed with that statement. They said, yeah, that pretty well fits how I sort of generally and simply kind of look at the world. The opposing view is our lives are threatened by terrorists, criminals, and illegal immigrants, and our priority should be to protect ourselves. Roughly about an equal percentage of the American population subscribed to that point of view. And what's, to me, is sort of interesting about this is the very small percentage of people that said, I'm not sure that I fit in either one of those. In other words, overwhelmingly, the majority of Americans could identify pretty strongly with one or the other. And those are opposing views, right? I mean, that's not just a little bit of, it's this. So it's possible that what has happened is we have developed some very different worldviews for any number of reasons, at least among the politically engaged. Now, in this study, they didn't try to separate out the engaged and the disengaged. So this one is suggesting that maybe the disengaged are a little bit more polarized than the previous research is suggesting. So some really good exit polling has been done on this election, and there's a lot to be learned. When we get the good, hard demographic information that will come down the road, we can reassess this. But in the meantime, what we've got is some very, very large-scale exit polling by a number of outfits. So what people had, they just had these as choices, and then you basically ranked where for you that issue lay in terms of its importance to you. And if you spend a moment looking at that, what you can see is, again, it's two different worldviews. A very different set of what's really important. And some things that presumably, for instance, Democrats said that they understood, but in point of fact, probably did not. There may have been a little too much of Democrats listening to Democrats and not listening to others. And there's some ongoing research now that suggests that that played a role in terms of campaign strategy. Some other possible reasons for our polarization. So Catherine Kramer is a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She spent years trying to understand what we're talking about right here and what's behind all of that. Her particular interest was in Wisconsin politics, and so she limited her research to the state of Wisconsin. And what she did was go out into communities of all different stripes, all different sizes, and so forth, and sort of insert herself into ongoing groups that sat around and talked about politics. And so she did that for several years, and did it so that people would open up when she was there and talk about their feelings. And when she completed the research, she ended up writing a book, and the title of the book is The Politics of Resentment. And what she found that was going on in Wisconsin, she was particularly trying to understand polarization in Wisconsin and how Wisconsin could elect a person like Scott Walker as governor of the state of Wisconsin, who was very different than the kinds of people Wisconsin had been electing as governor. And so her sort of bottom line conclusion was this: people in rural areas are making sense of politics in a way that places resentment towards those in cities at the center. And the word city here you can use as sort of shorthand for a number of things. Urban dwellers, educated elite snobs, like professors from the University of Madison, Wisconsin. She did encounter that quite a bit, but they still talk to her. And so, whereas once upon a time, perhaps one of the major factors that divided us was the regional differences going back to the history of slavery and the abolition movement, there's some good reason to believe that what's replacing that now is a little bit less of that kind of regional polarization, if you will, and an urban-rural sort of polarization. If you pull up a map of the current election or of the previous presidential election or the ones before that, and a map that nicely shows which candidate that state voted for, you get blue on the West Coast, blue on from about Maryland north on the East Coast, a couple of little splotches of blue in the center, and this massive red in the center. Somewhat reinforcing her point of view. Since her book came out, there's been some additional political science research that's been done that's gone out and asked people in rural areas, and give them statements, do you agree with this or not? We feel we're not getting our fair share of resources. Urban people look down on us, educated people look down on us, and so forth. And you got overwhelming agreement by people in rural areas with those statements. Again, just I mentioned that to sort of reinforce her research. It's a very interesting piece of research. It's a lot of time interviewing people and sitting down and chatting with them. But something I think very important to keep in mind. So another way to look at it, so here's the breakdown on voting in this current election. So no surprise in terms of the variables that are here on this screen. It's white men that voted for Trump. If we further refine that, the best way to further refine that is to add one more variable, and that's educational level. So if we had white men with less than a college education, that percentage would jump up noticeably. The single biggest switch by far, and it's actually not just a switch from the previous election, it's been happening for some time, is the second row, Latino men. This is depending on which numbers you look at, but it's roughly somewhere between about a 13 to 15 percentage point change from previous elections. It is just a huge swing. And so, again, if one wants to understand what's going on, one needs to have a lot of conversations with some Latino men and figure out what's going on with that one. A majority of white women voted for Trump. And then we get into flipping that around and those groups that were very strongly voting for Harris. Latino women, black men, and the group that's always been the strongest and most loyal supporters of the Democratic Party, black women. This is the current stuff. And there's others that have sort of sliced and diced this differently, but it's all sort of, at the moment anyway, saying the same thing. Then there's one other thing that I wanted to raise that I'm not sure how prevalent what I'm about to talk about this is, but it's of some concern. So Steve Hanke is a very bright guy and a very conservative guy who's written a number of things about liberty and freedom and democracy. And I think a not unfair summary of what he has recently written is this: democracy and liberty are separable notions, and liberty is the more important and under attack. And then one other conservative writer: the real reason we in the Republican base don't care about Trump's norm breaking is that we have always believed that liberty is more important than democracy. Very similar kind of language. So a question arises in my mind: is this yet another dimension of some change in the political culture that is fueling some of this polarization that gets talked about a little bit, but not much. And you've probably heard of something called Project 2025, and this is very common language throughout that. So what suggests to me, as I say, there's not enough data that we have to know how widespread this attitude is. It clearly exists. You've got some very bright people that are articulating this point, but something that I think is worth further investigation, and if it turns out to be more widespread, then I don't know about you, but terribly troublesome and troubling. But in some senses, it harkens back to early periods of America where this actually was part of the debate. So anyway, that's out there. Let me move on to a couple of more sort of positive things. Angela Alsobrooks just won the seat for U.S. Senate in Maryland, defeating a very popular former Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan. Lisa Blunt Rochester just won the race for the open seat in Delaware for the U.S. Senate. So for the first time in the history of the United States, there will be two black women in the Senate at the same time. First time in the history of the United States, just to emphasize that point. They are both seasoned politicians, It's also a very bittersweet time for also Brooks. She started her career as a lawyer and migrated into the area of prosecution, particularly prosecuting domestic violence cases, and started dabbling more into politics and kind of going back and forth. And at that point, probably her primary mentor was a woman by the name of Kamala Harris. And Elsa Brooks and Harris are very close friends, and Harris never stopped mentoring Elsa Brooks. So an interesting time for her. Rochester is interesting. She's been in the House of Representatives, and she's received a lot of commendation for her work on trying to put together bipartisan groups to push legislation. She's, in effect, in the House, became kind of an expert on bipartisanship and was somebody who got really trusted for that. Andy Kim won the Senate race in New Jersey, replacing everybody's favorite Democrat, Bob Menendez. Sorry about that for those of you from New Jersey. So Andy Kim is currently in the House of Representatives, highly respected member of Congress, and becomes the first Korean American in the Senate in the history of the United States. So some interesting firsts before you get overly depressed. Julie Fedorchik won the seat for a member of the House of Representatives from North Dakota. The other three are Democrats. Julie is a Republican. What's interesting, she's a first also. The first woman in the entire history of the state of North Dakota to ever be elected to Congress. Yeah. That leaves one state. There is still a state that has never elected a female member of the United States Congress, Mississippi. So, work to be done. Then, these are all interesting because these are some of those who have won or probably will win a couple of elections that are up here on the screen that haven't actually been completely decided. But I put these up because in the case of Capter and in the case of Golden, they won in House districts, in congressional districts, that were very strongly won by Trump. And in the case of the four senators up there, all of those states were won by Trump. So when trying to understand this election and trying to understand polarization, one has to sometimes take some sort of counterfactuals into account and begin to suggest the whole thing just doesn't go in one nice, simple direction. As usual, we are an interesting, sometimes confusing, and sometimes confused nation. My final comment is about some possible ideas of how to move forward for those who are concerned about polarization and might want to do something about it. So something that has existed worldwide for going back particularly to about the 1980s is a phenomenon called citizen assemblies. The typical citizen assembly is a group of about 50 to 100 people or 200 people, intentionally brought together in a ways that there is the sort of cross-fertilization, if you will, of different points of view. So you first randomly select, and then you sort of double-check that and make sure you've got different points of view in the group. The group typically exists within a local jurisdiction and is given then a specific policy issue to work on. This is not a voted-in body of decision makers, so this group never has the power to make the decision. But they always get appointed in a way that the local decision-making body acknowledges the existence and the importance of the citizen assembly. There's not an agreement typically on the part of the decision-making body, say a city council or county supervisors or whatever. that they will abide by the recommendation, but that they will take it seriously. So there are a good 800 of these around the world that have been happening since the 1980s. They are probably been most popular in Europe, and again, it's typically dealing with local issues. The closest one that I know to here is one that happened a few years ago in Petaluma. So these citizen assemblies do exist in the United States. And then there are a number of other efforts out there. There is an effort that is largely focused on university campuses called Dialogue Across Differences. And it's the same kind of thing. It comes out of some research that was done back particularly in the 70s and 80s again, around how you deal with distrust and mistrust around political thinking and political points of view. And a number of these have developed and become sort of permanent features of the campus across many campuses in the United States. So a couple of things to think about on the positive sense. I don't want to leave us with nothing but doom and gloom. So again, polarization has been a feature of American political culture and American political behavior for a long, long period of time. I wanted to focus on Roosevelt and the Great Depression and World War II, and as well as the negative side of that coin in terms of the literally selling out of blacks during that period of time, to suggest how difficult it can be if the goal is to get down to where there's sort of no polarization or almost none. Then that's that's the model. I really don't like the idea of another world war, for instance, as the only tactic that's going to get Americans together again. So anyway, enough for me. Yes.
How would grand juries fit into citizen assemblies?
Yeah, good question. I mean, grand juries are sort of fact-finding bodies, and it deals specifically, of course, within the judicial system, whereas this is dealing really with the legislative component of the political system. And this one is not just about fact-finding, that's a key part of it, but it's really about deliberating solutions to whatever the problem might be that gets assigned to the assembly.
Just one point of interest and one question. We have a local Brave Little Angels group, which is also trying to deal with polarization. There's also several other online that other kinds of organizations I can share.
Yeah, good. Yeah,
Good.
yeah. There's lots of yes.
So
Very
my
good.
question is, and maybe this is a dumb question, but what's the difference between freedom and liberty?
Largely, it means the same thing to people. The question that I would have is, so how these people like Steve Hanke, how in the long run can you maximize liberty or freedom without democracy? Because that's what they're doing, right? They're pitting it against it. Now, he's not saying no democracy, but he is saying that if you have to focus on one or the other, it's liberty. And then the next question is, well, okay, Steve, whose liberty to do what? And that's wherein we get it. Now, the initial response is going to go back to the protection of property, because that's the one that a lot would argue has been under assault by an increasingly sizable government. And there are certainly a whole series of legitimate issues around that, and issues that always have to be debated. You know, what is the proper size of government? How regulatory should the government be? And that should be debated. That's right at the core of political debate, right? But at some point, the idea that you sort of flip it all and democracy becomes the secondary concern is what, to me anyway, as a political scientist, is troubling. Yeah.
My question relates to the same issue. How can the dichotomy of liberty versus democracy, and liberty being the conservative perspective, how is that reconciled with their anti-abortion position?
Right, so it goes back to what I just said. Whose liberty for whose purposes are we talking about? Exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, so I don't, but you knew I didn't have the answer for that one. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I was wondering about the effect of social media and kind of relatedly also political actors being able to use social media as an amplifier of polarization.
Going through this, putting that together, the slideshow together, I had to eliminate some, it was long enough as it was, right? But you're absolutely right on. So the reason for sticking in the thing about the newspapers during the Federalist, Anti-Federalists was to sort of suggest, yes, and I think it's a huge issue. And what you get is, and you increasingly get people who live in their own, the proper phrase now is media bubbles, right? And don't listen to anything except the ones that they like. And so you can create a reality. I mean, it is very, I don't know if any of you have been to, like, say, a Trump rally. It's it's quite a phenomenon. I mean, they're a cross between a county fair, a music festival, a swap meet, and then sort of down the road is a political rally. And I haven't been to one myself either. I don't want to pretend I have, but I've read quite a bit about people who have spent a fair amount of time there and trying to really understand it. And it's an interesting phenomenon because the reporters who have done this they would spend enough time that the attendees would feel comfortable with them and felt like they were being acknowledged. And what you come away with is really just a very different sense of what's real and what isn't out there. But if this is what you listen to all of the time, and it's done repeatedly, and it's not just it's not just Fox News, right? I mean, it's Newsmax and News One and on and on and on. And then then in terms of X and all the other that kind of social media, it gets reinforced. So I think it's very problematic, and I don't have any simple answers. The one thing, by the way, just one thing I'll say. John Adams and the Federalists in the late, just before the turn of the century, got so upset with the 19th century version, or really the 18th century version of the question that you asked, that they enacted a set of laws that came to be called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And one of the consequences of that was that there were any number of newspaper publishers criticizing John Adams and the Federalists who ended up in prison. And it's one of the things that really helped elect Thomas Jefferson was the reaction, against that. So that was the thinking about how you solve that problem then, and not a very good solution. Yes.
I'm interested to know more about the citizen assemblies. Who appoints them, and around what issue do they get their discussion going? And then what happens?
There's a variety of ways that happens. The most common way is that the equivalent of a city council has just simply decided that we're having a hard time resolving issues ourselves, and exactly and that's a very common one. Transportation and housing, transportation and housing in the European environment have been the most common ones. So there's a sort of sanctioning of this by a city council or a provincial council that really then gets the ball rolling on, and then they'll talk to people who, like say a League of Women Voters, and enlist an organization like that to say, help us in the process of drawing the people, letting people know that it's out there, that there will be a lottery, you will be selected by lottery. And that the idea is to get you together and to stay together and try to find a way through what we know is your naturally polarizing inclination, and then to work this out. And there's I don't want to overdo it. 800 over a 40-year period or something around a whole bunch of different is not a lot. And it's not like in every single case of those that did happen that the assembly recommendation got accepted. But there are a lot of countries that, though they haven't done it a ton of times, have returned to it. So suggesting some inclination to want to do that. Yes.
These two things may not be related, but I think it's an interesting thing that as we're increasing in polarization, at the same time, the Overton scale is moving to the right.
The what scale?
The scale, like, the political spectrum, like how far generally are we left or right?
Okay, gotcha.
Like, so the left is moving more right, the right is moving even further right.
Okay, go ahead.
How is that happening at the same time, I guess? Like, if the left is generally coming closer to where the right used to be.
So I would dispute that.
Okay. I'm curious.
Yeah. So if you can think back to those diagrams that were there on not the maps of Congress, but of the people, but if you got close to them and really studied it, you would know one thing, which is that the conservatives have moved more right than the liberals have moved left. So that part is, the evidence is clearly there. Now, to suggest that the liberals have sort of moved right, I don't think there's much evidence for that from this research. There may be some anecdotal stuff that we could talk about that would suggest that possibility. But I think more what has happened is if you will, the right moving further, more to the right than the left has moved to the left. And there are plenty of those on the left in the Democratic Party that would say that's part of the big problem with the Democrats. I mean, that's what Bernie Sanders is saying, right? And AOC is saying, on and on and on, that the Democrats have kind of abandoned a little bit of some of that. But anyway, there's going to be some ferocious internal Democratic debates, right? I mean, there already are, and it's not going to get any nicer for a while, at least not at the national level.
I'm going to go back to the discussion regarding Professor Hankey's
Yes.
study. So, and there were learned Republicans that we're talking about who are saying, let's have more freedom and liberty. And what is the explanation for them choosing a leader who represents a more authoritarian government and less freedom?
That's when you go back to his question here about the media and its impact. Because if you pay attention to that media, it sort of gets explained how that works out. It's an explanation I have difficulty with, but it sort of. So what you're doing is that you blame the lack of freedom on all of this crazy liberal, intellectual, bureaucratic, with particularly emphasizing the bureaucratic part of all of this. And if you can blow that up, then you can actually get more democracy and more liberty. And because it's that bureaucracy run by, all these urban university types that are not helping us in the rural areas in the least, that it's a problem. There's way too many of them. So, for instance, one of the things that I suspect will be one of the very first policies that will be enacted, and then I'm not positive about this, but I think Trump has the authority to do this on his own, is something that's called Schedule F. And what Schedule F does is to take the top 3 levels of the bureaucracy employees, federal employees, GS through G15, and redefine them as political appointees. And so, which I think is roughly, 80,000, 90,000 people. And you would just, now when he was president before, he actually did enact that, and then it was one of the first things that Biden rescinded. So it's not currently law, but given what he did in 2017, maybe 18, would suggest that, and I don't remember any court challenges to it, so that's one thing that could be done. But yes, to your question, the basic answer is, I think, again, that reality, yeah. Yes?
Having been a psychotherapist for 20 years, I'd like to know what individual characteristics draw people together and prevent them from getting a divorce.
Right. And prevent them from what?
Getting a divorce.
Getting a divorce. And you're asking me that. We should be asking you. I'm not going there. I'm going to keep my marriage. I mean,
I appreciated hearing your comments about liberty and showing liberty versus democracy. Can you provide the same kind of thoughts about how you define democracy for us? The country was founded, or at least so we've been told, based on a concept of liberty, getting out from under rule by a government, in the example of a king.
right,
Okay.
right.
So I'm not convinced that we are really so far apart between whatever we're calling liberty and what we're calling democracy. I think it's a contrived and intentional division in ways. And I would really appreciate, you made comments about what liberty
Right.
means, freedom.
Okay.
I would
Right.
appreciate the same for democracy.
I guess we don't have another hour, do we? So if you go back to the early debates about this, so the first thing in terms of your question that was debated was democracy. What is democracy? The so-called founders or framers essentially rejected the word democracy because they understood democracy to be classical Athenian full citizen participation democracy. And they said you can't have that unless your total unit of government is, and of the nation is something really, really small if you're going to have all of the citizens participate. So so one of the reasons for the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists was many of the Anti-Federalists said, we actually really want democracy and we do understand that it can only exist in small units. And we want to keep pushing that way. So the term that got used, and the classic explanation for all of this, for those of you who are really interested in, is James Madison's Federalist Paper number 10. And in Federalist number 10, Madison makes the argument about why we are a representative republic and not a democracy. So that's one thing. The other thing that comes out, if you read carefully Federalist number 10, Madison's biggest fear, it turns out, in my estimation in reading that, is tyranny of the majority. And that's an interesting one to me as the number one fear, right? Because the whole point of even representative democracy is based on the notion of, the consent of the governed through majority rule by the governed selected bodies. So we kind of got beyond that, and I thought we had, in terms of at least a majoritarian point of view, that you could protect liberty and you could have democracy. So the liberty that gets always worried about is the liberty of the minority. But it's not minority in how we think of it today in terms of the notion of minority rights. It's in terms of the large property owners, and back in those days, the slave owners. It's their liberty that they worried about. That was the minority that they feared would be under attack. So in some sense, a statement like Steve Hanke is bringing us back full circle, isn't it? What he's really saying is that we're afraid that the liberty and the freedoms of the minority, Elon Musk et al., is what's under attack by these liberal, college-educated bureaucrats. I mean, right? Regulations around what businesses can do and can't do, what you can put in products and what you can't put in products. I mean, right? There's a whole sort of regulatory state that's not terribly popular. And there's a whole list of sort of liberties, if you will. Once you could put, pretty much anything in a package and call it cereal, and now you actually have to have stuff that's supposed to be reasonably healthy. Well, For those who made money off of putting junk and unhealthy stuff in there, they've lost a liberty, right? That's where that thinking, yeah, I know. I know, I'm ready for my wine this evening too. I'm sorry about it. Thank you.
So in a few days, you'll be able to view the presentation again. You could sign up for Professor Hughes' next Ollie class, or you could invite him to your next dinner party. So we will see.
Wouldn't that be fun?
We'll see everybody in January. Thank you for coming.